Hey guys, today we're going to be going over natural selection and selective breeding. I'm going to be using this EduSmart to go through some information with you all. I won't be going through every single slide, but just follow along and we will go over how natural selection occurs as well as what is selective breeding. So millions of years ago, horses, they were no bigger than dogs. You see this? This was an ancestral horse millions of years ago, and it's just about the size of this Dalmatian here. So these organisms have developed differently over time. Obviously, our modern day horse looks nothing like this. And so the reason why our horse nowadays looks different is due to natural selection. Okay, these transformations, they're a result of genetic changes in species. So as we can see, not only horses are the ones that have changed, many organisms have changed over time due to natural selection. And we need to remember that natural selection happens over a long period of time. Natural selection happens because of variations, because of genetic changes in those organisms. We know that not all organisms are the same. Just because we have two dogs that are both Dalmatians doesn't mean that they're both going to be the same. So the process of changing is called natural selection, in which some genes are favored over others and spread throughout the gene pool. Because our population of organisms is diverse or different, and because there's variety or variations in the genes, some of the organisms are better adapted to their changing environment. And because they're better adapted, they're able to survive and reproduce to pass on their traits. So some of the genes are favored. That means if they're favored, it's helping them live in the environment in which they are. And so if they live long enough to grow old and be able to mate and reproduce, like I said, they pass on those genetic traits. So most of the genetic changes are the result of changing environmental conditions. Something is happening in their environment which is causing some of the organisms to be killed off and some of the organisms to have beneficial traits that allows them to survive. Okay, so again, we know that no two organisms are exactly the same. There's some variations, and by variations we mean differences. And some of these variations can be size, they can be color, they can be shape. So those are some of the minor variations. So even though you have the same type of butterfly, they might be a slightly different color or one might be bigger than the other. Same thing with the horses. Yes, they are all horses, but some of the horses might be taller than the others. One of them might have longer legs than the other. So one of them might be faster than the other. So these small variations can cause huge changes in a species. Okay, so here we have the horse. It's evolved. So obviously it looks very different, and it didn't just go jump from one type to the next. It gradually changed, and again over millennia, because this natural selection takes a very long time to happen. And you have to remember the natural selection cannot occur without genetic variations in species. So these genetic variations, they're what ensure that some organisms can survive an environmental change. So we're going to take a look at and see what happened to the horses and why did it change so much throughout the years. Okay, so because we have size variation, some of the horses were better able to survive the environment. Some of the horses were taller, and so therefore they can see the predators coming easier than a shorter horse would. And so because the taller horse saw the predator coming, it was able to start running away quicker. And also horses that were faster were able to get away from the predators. So therefore the horses that were smaller and that were slower got attacked by the predators and they were eaten. So therefore they didn't get to grow old to reproduce and pass on their traits. But The taller, faster horse did. It got away. So therefore it was able to survive. And so it survived. It was able to grow old enough to mate and reproduce. And so therefore it passed on those genetic traits to its offspring. And so the little baby horses that were born with those traits to be taller and to be faster. And so this continued happening over and over and over again throughout the years. The slower, shorter horses kept getting killed off by the predators, and so the taller, faster horses kept reproducing over and over each time. And so now, after millions of years, it resulted in a change in the population, and it's dominated by large horses. Now, the horses that we're used to are big and fast and tall. So remember again, it is due to genetic variations, to differences. And natural selection cannot happen without that. If they were all to have been short and slow, well, then they would have all been killed off by the predators. But because of those differences, the taller, faster ones were able to survive and reproduce. And they kept doing that over and over and over until now we have this larger, faster horse. So being able to escape from predators, the bigger horses could live long enough, find mates, produce offspring, and the shorter ones couldn't. This is the process of natural selection. So the large size trait got passed on to the offspring, became more common in the horse population. Over time, this led to the development of modern day horses. Okay, so the process in which only the individuals best suited to a particular environment survive and pass on the genetic traits to future generations is called natural selection. You need to know that. There has to be favorable variations in a population for evolution or natural selection to happen. The favorable trait for the horses was being tall and fast. So just like horses, beetles that inherit advantageous traits, like the brown coloration of these beetles, are better able to escape from predators. They're able to get resources and they're able to reproduce. So the variations in these beetles, as you can see, some of them are brown, some of them are green. Well, their environment is brown. Therefore, the brown beetle has an advantageous trait because it's brown and it's able to camouflage with the tree. It's able to evade predators. It's harder to see a brown beetle than it is to see a bright green beetle. So the bright green beetles get eaten by the birds, and therefore they don't get to survive to be able to reproduce to pass on the trait of being green. But the brown ones do. They're able to survive, they're able to reproduce, and when they reproduce, their offspring are also brown. So then the green color is a disadvantageous trait. The brown color is an advantageous trait. And over time, the majority of those beetles are going to be brown. One phrase that you may hear is survival of the fittest. The organism that can best survive in the environment to reproduce is the winner. Okay. You may also hear about the Galapagos finches. So there are some islands called the Galapagos Islands, and there are some finches there. Finches are these birds, and they all come from the same ancestor. But as you can see, they all have different beaks. So they have those beaks because of the type of food that's available on the island that they live on. And so depending on whether they eat berries or bugs or nuts, that depends on what kind of beak those birds have. They're adapted to living in that environment. Over time, those finches that are adapted to that environment, they pass on that trait. And so the other finches tended to die off So now each island has their own type of finch with its own type of beak based on the food that's available. Now, here's an example where we can see natural selection occurring. So again, we said that it takes a long period of time. Sometimes it could be sped up a bit. So for example, there was a recent drought on one of these islands. A drought means that it hasn't rained in a long time, and so there's not enough water. So because there wasn't a lot of water, a lot of the plants died, and so what was left in this area was some large seeds with tough outer coats. All the other seeds, died off. There was not enough water because of the drought. So because these seeds are large with tough outer coats, only the birds with the tough beaks, large beaks, were able to break them open. So then the other birds with the thinner, pointier beaks were not able to survive. So out of these finches, only the finch with the seed-eating finch was able to survive. The other ones died off. So finches with the large beaks could easily crack open these large seeds, but those with small beaks could not. Again, they died. And so therefore the finches with the large beaks were the ones that were able to survive, reproduce, pass on the genetic trait of having the large beak to its offspring. And so now most of the finch population that lives on that island has large beaks. And so there we saw an example of natural selection happening, survival of the fittest, who was best able to adapt to the changing environment. And that was the finch with the tough beaks, large beaks, because they were able to crack open those seeds to keep alive. So this is natural selection. And again, you need to remember that it does not happen if there are no variations in a species. If there's no differences, then natural selection cannot happen. So there has to be diversity. There have to be variations in the population in order for natural selection and evolution to happen. One other thing that you need to know about is selective breeding. So selective breeding is the process where humans are selecting favorable traits from animals and plants for what we want, and we are making them reproduce that way. So with natural selection, it was nature and survival of the fittest, and that's happening through variations in the organisms. Selective breeding is when people are saying, hey, I want a dog with this trait and this trait, so I'm going to make both of these dogs breed so that I can get that. We do that with plants as well. For example, this wheat. The wheat that's shorter is more wind resistant because it's not getting a lot of wind damage. And so it's also more resistant to disease. So then we'll take the seeds from that wheat and we will replant them because that's the kind we want. We do this with dogs. We do this with cows. So one of the examples that you're given often is about dairy cows. So if you have a dairy farm, you obviously want a cow that makes a lot of milk. So you're going to find the cow that makes the most milk, and you're going to make it breed in order for its offspring to also produce a lot of milk. So you're choosing the traits from the organisms that you want, and you're making them breed so that the offspring can be what you want them to be. In selective breeding, people, not nature, controls which organisms reproduce. So we do this with plants. We do this with animals. If I plant corn, I'm going to pick the corn that's the biggest and that's the most disease resistant. And I will plant those seeds again the following year so that my corn can continue to get better and better. And every year I'll find the best corn so that I can replant it and try to make my crops better. One of the most common examples of selective breeding is through dogs. Depending on what kind of dog you want, you will find the two parents with the traits that you would like and have them breed. So that's an example of selective breeding. I hope this helps you guys understand the difference between the two. Thank